Welcome to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
How do you get from point A to point B to point C to point D inside of an organization? And what specifically does it take to work your way into that dream position that you want? Well, welcome to Talent Optimization. Today, we're chatting in depth about creating talent pathways inside of your organization. And guess what? So much of this has to do with your talent strategy. That strategy is going to lay out what that specifically looks like. And I don't know about you, but I've often walked into organizations and really struggled with, is this a dead-end job or how do we get to the next level? And as we chat with staff and chat with managers and leadership teams, we find that sometimes that this is a very, very real issue. And what it comes down to is it comes down to time. And so often we think we're crystal clear on the communication that is specifically needed. And we find out, guess what? That hasn't happened. So if you're curious about communication that drives results, go back to episode 18, where we specifically talk about that, because how we communicate and ensuring that we are crystal clear on the expectations that we want at the very end are going to allow us to really get there and to be able to see how all of the points fit together. So when we look at creating a talent strategy, there's really several different steps that we're going to look at. And then we're going to also look at 3 pathways to create it. So I want to start with, what are the 3 pathways that you can create inside of your organization? And guess what? You can create all 3 of these. And so often you definitely need all 3 of these pathways. One of the pathways that is the traditional pathway inside of organizations is a pathway into leadership or management positions. So often we see that, hey, if we're going to move up that so-called ladder, that means you have to manage other people. But let's face it, some of us are not great managers, and we're not necessarily great leaders of people. We might be great leaders in other areas. And so it's really important that you have 2 distinct pathways. You have that specialist or that expert pathway that is that individual contributor that is amazing at that thing that they're doing inside the organization. So often we see these as maybe it's a technician 1, a technician 2, a technician 3, where they then can become that source of information for new staff coming in, but they're not responsible for managing or mentoring necessarily, because that's not their skill set and their sweet spot. But again, they're amazing individual contributors. The next pathway is our traditional pathway. This is our leadership pathway. And this is where we move into, increasingly elevated positions where we're managing others, right? And the third pathway that we are seeing evolve so much more is a pathway that is very much team-based, where we're looking at what are the teams that we need to create inside the organizations. And within those teams, what is the strategy that they need to execute? What are the outcomes that they're responsible for creating? And the key here is that this is different than the outputs, right? An output would be, hey, show up and record a podcast today, where an outcome is through that podcast, we want to reach X number of individuals and educate on how to create talent pathways. And so with that, for these teams, when we say, hey, we're going to create pathways for individuals to come into teams, what we're doing is we are allowing individuals to grow in many different ways. So often what we see is, hey, as we get promoted through an organization, it may be in a specific department, or it may be across specific disciplines or across the business, learning different areas of the business. But because we give these arbitrary titles, at times it feels like we're going back down to go back up again, right? And so if we hire into teams, so often in organizations, we have work teams that are on a project for a year or 2 years. We can hire them into those teams knowing there's going to be another team that's going to open up that's going to give them a different opportunity to step into. So one of the analogies that we love to use is it's kind of like climbing a mountain. If you look at climbing a mountain, many times you're going up and then you're taking a switch back, and then you're going up and then you're taking a switch back, right? Because what that's doing is it's allowing us to get to the top of that mountain or whatever that pinnacle or peak of our career is, but doing it in a way that we're understanding and we're getting the experience of each of those multiple areas. So those are 3 distinct talent pathways, right? We have our team-based pathway. We have the pathway where we're looking at roles going up specifically in a leadership management track. And we have a pathway that's very much a specialist pathway. Here's the deal. Do our staff know what those key pathways are? And do we, as leaders inside of our organization, know what it looks like to really create those pathways? And so there's a couple kind of items that we definitely want to chat about. And there's 7 very specific steps that we typically see with this. And when we look at these specific steps, one of them is thinking ahead, knowing, hey, what are those positions that we maybe need now and or in the future? One of the things that we know is that the jobs we have today may not and probably won't be the same jobs we have in 20 years, right? So, we know that there will be a distinction as artificial intelligence comes into place, as we start using robotics, especially more in manufacturing types of positions, that we really need to pay attention to what will that job look like in the future so that we can upskill our staff as we continue to evolve in the world of work that we're currently in. So that thinking ahead is a key piece, but also thinking ahead into, we know it's incredibly difficult to hire today. Knowing how hard it is to hire, where can we start to get individuals interested in not only our entry-level jobs, but our mid and top-level jobs? And some of that is doing that education in the community and thinking ahead to what that looks like. So, for example, when we're hiring in a base level position, so let's say we're hiring in a teller at a bank, we know that for that bank teller, we typically want that individual to be pretty process oriented. They need to be pretty detail focused, but we also know that typically they're going to follow rules pretty closely and they're going to lead through collaborating with a team. Knowing that if we're going to put them in a track, let's say into a management position, we know that we're going to have to hire a certain percentage of individuals that have a little bit of a higher behavioral trait that's independent leadership style versus a leadership style that's really working collaboratively inside of a team. And so these behavioral traits become incredibly important when we do our talent pathway planning, because we need to know, what does the job need? What are the individuals in the job? What are their strengths? And do we have that pathway? Because if we don't, we know we're going to have to hire outside of the organization for that, which is much more difficult to do than hiring inside the organization. So the next step that we have is really, we want to focus on the right traits. What are those right traits inside the organization that we're specifically looking for? And again, these go back to those behavioral traits that we just talked about. And when we look specifically at those, we know that, do we need individuals that are really extroverted in this role? Or do we need individuals that are going to get down, get to work, be able to work behind the scenes? Those are the key things that we need to know for our jobs, and know that as we look at our talent pathway, we're going to be needing different types of behavioral traits to move up through those pathways. And looking at that and saying, okay, I know that 60% of the people I hire into this role will stay in this role, or they may move into a specialist pathway, or we may move them onto another team so that they have an experience with another type of department. But it's the same skill set that we're going to be using. So we know exactly those skill sets and where they go across the organization so that we know how to move individuals around. And that's those behavioral traits that become really important. And by the way, there is an easy button for this. For us, we use Predictive Index. I know that there's several of you that use DISC, that use Myers-Briggs, some of the other tools that are out there. We use Predictive Index because it's predictive of job performance, and we can tie it right back into the job. That makes creating these talent pathways, much easier inside the organization to get us much better results. And another key here is just asking people what they want, right? How many of you have ever been in an interview and you get the question of, hey, what specifically are your plans for 5 years from now? Where do you see yourself, right? That's such a great question for candidates. But my challenge for our HR listeners and our executive listeners today is really think about, what's your 5-year people plan? What's your 5-year talent strategy? Because what we're missing so often is we're not tying in, where does an individual want to be in 5 years, to what does the organization need in its people and jobs in 5 years? And can we really map an individual's career out with them up front? Now, one of the key things that we're seeing as we're talking with our career counselors, as we're talking with individuals at the college level and the high school level that are working with students trying to plan out their career, is they don't see the whole picture. They don't see the end of, hey, if I step into this entry-level position, how do I get from point A to point B, C, and D? And we, as executives and HR professionals, need to do a much better job of laying those pathways out so individuals can visualize them at the onset, because that's going to impact how we retain staff throughout. And again, going back to ask people what they want, because when we don't ask them, guess what? They don't know. And I don't know if you've ever had a situation where you're not talking with someone, whether it is a spouse or, a supervisor or a coworker or whatnot, and you just start making things up, right? How scary is it when we start making things up that aren't the appropriate things? It's really scary. And what we make up is probably much worse than what is actually out there. So guess what, leaders? I'm going to challenge you to share, what is your plan for the folks inside of your organization? And have them plan with you, because that's going to be incredibly important for how successful they are. And one of the things to think about is go back to episode 16, where we talk with Joy Deuce. And Joy specifically talks about the importance of succession planning and ensuring that individuals are on the same page. So that might be a really great conversation to take a listen to if this is something that you're really focused on. So the third kind of step within this that we're going to talk about today is promoting from within. So our first step is thinking ahead. Our second step is focusing on the right traits. Our third step is promoting from within. So when we promote from within, we are much more apt to have a candidate that has a less ramp up time, because they already know the organization, they already know the people, they already know the expectations. And so one of the things we love about Predictive Index is that you can just pull a report that says, who are the other matches for this specific job, and see very quickly from a behavioral standpoint and from a cognitive standpoint, who is a good fit. And when we can see who a good fit is, we can start having those conversations. And that is always a part of that talent pathway planning, right? So they may need to gain experience, or they may need to gain a certification or education. But if we know that they're a behavioral fit for a job, we can start planning that years, months in advance. Our fourth step here is to hire for the job and not what makes you feel good. Okay, so here's what we mean by that. Now, if we are going to go out and just hire blind without any data and any science to back it up, we have this bias. We more than likely are going to hire people just like us, right? And the issue with hiring people just like us is one, there's no diversity in that. But two, so often our teams end up incredibly lopsided and are unable to actually meet the performance expectations that's necessary because we may have a ton of visionaries on our team, but we don't have any implementers on our team. Or we have, individuals on our team that are these great visionaries, which means they're hitting the gas pedal and going 90 miles an hour down the freeway, and they're not paying attention to the other things that are around them. There's nobody there pushing the brake and saying, hold on, we're in icy conditions, or hold on, there is tumbleweed rolling across the road that we really need to pay attention to. So that's number 4, is we need to hire for the job. And when we hire for the job, and specifically for the team that this individual is stepping into, we are going to be able to ensure that we can meet those business results based on the strategy that we have. We're also increasing the diversity inside of our organization. And with that pathway planning, individuals know where they're going. And when we know where we're going and we have specific goals, we're much more likely to get there in a shorter period of time. And it increases employee engagement, right? So the 5th thing is to use data. And we've talked about this a bit already today. So when we're creating our talent pathway planning, we want to use data. There's a couple different types of data that are incredibly important. The first type of data is the data that tells us what does the job need. And we typically will create this using some job assessments and matching that to who an individual is based on their behaviors and based on their cognitive ability, right? And then that second piece of data really comes from what are the key expectations of this job? What are those outcomes that individuals need to hit? And when we can specifically look at that data and promote individuals within the organization based on hitting key metrics, guess what? That data is going to be gold in also creating that loyalty and trust with staff, because they're going to see, hey, I know if I do these things, I will be promoted because I'm seeing it happen all throughout the organization. And the pathway is laid out in front of me for me to just jump on and follow the key steps that may seem small at the time, but are going to get us to the big results at the end. But it has to start with a plan and the strategy. The 6th thing that we want to talk about is the dream team. And as we create those dream teams inside of our organization, we have to ensure with those dream teams that we have the right makeup on the team. So for example, if we have a team that is all sales folks and they're very results oriented and they're incredibly competitive, that's fantastic. However, if we don't have a balancer on that team that really shows them, hey, we have to have some teamwork, we have to pull together, because our competition isn't each other. Our competition is those other organizations outside of ours that is going to get the business versus us, right? And so these are very real problems that we see over and over inside of organizations. And when we create those teams, we need to ensure that we have the balancing impact on the team to actually move the team forward to get the job done. And as we lay out those pathways, we also want to layer in what are the compensation plans that go along with this, both from the individual basis, but also from the team basis. So in a situation like I just described, where we have a very competitive sales team and they're very results discipline, oriented, and we need to have a balancer that's a teamwork oriented individual, we also want a bonus based on how the team does versus just how the individuals do there. So that's just something key to keep in mind. And the last one is, when we talk about talent pathways, we really want to pay close attention to making people better, both from the human side and the productivity side, right? Because here's the deal. As those talent pathways go through the organization, we need to up-level and upskill our staff. We need to ensure that they have the appropriate training and they have the leadership development and the coaching so that they can really step into those higher level roles, whether that is leading a team, whether that is being a very, very unique specialist in an area. And so as we take care of those staff, guess what? They're going to take care of us based on their loyalty, based on the trust within the organization. So with that, I will just kind of go through those 7 steps again that are really important in creating those talent pathways inside the organization. So the first step is to think ahead. The second is let's focus on those right traits, those behavioral traits. The third is, really ensuring that we're promoting from within. If you use PI, take a look at those match scores so that you can really lay that out. The fourth thing that we're looking at is hiring for the job and not what we want as a manager, because we end up hiring people just like us. We want to make sure that we're using the data to really drive our decisions. We want to make sure we're focused on the dream teams and specifically the human element. So with that, of course, we start to wrap up and end all of our podcasts by saying, hey, what is one key takeaway for our executives listening? And as we create dream teams inside of our organization and those talent pathways, that one takeaway for our executives is plan out how individuals will flow through the organization from entry into the chief executive officer position, because it's not just succession planning that plays into talent pathway planning. It is also how individuals will grow and be engaged in the work that they're doing. And then our key takeaway for HR professionals is have a systematic way to do this and be sure to track what an individual wants with what the organization needs, and ensure that you have that key clarity and communication to your staff so that they don't leave without knowing that there's a huge opportunity right around the corner for them. So with that, thank you so much for joining us here today at Talent Optimization with Elevated Talent Consulting. And be sure to join our Talent Optimization Foundation program, where we get deep into each of these topics, each of these steps, and we actually show you how to do it through our live office hours and webinars. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.